A single child's scream tore through La Lumiere like a gunshot in church. In the private corner booth, a little boy no more than 4 thrashed against crimson velvet, face crimson too, fists clenched around a crumpled napkin as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. And beside him sat the man no one approached. Edward N. Robinson. Tailored black suit, hugging shoulders that looked built to carry corpses, not dinner jackets. Ink climbing his throat like black flames licking toward a face carved from winter. Eyes the color of a loaded gun. Staff whispered his name the way sailors once whispered, Kraken. No one moved. No one breathed too loud. Linda T. Wilt had been on the clock exactly 6 hours and 12 minutes, long enough to learn rule number 1. You do not go near Edward Robinson's table unless he raises one finger. Long enough to know breaking that rule would get her fired before the dessert cart rolled out. Her feet ached in shoes one size too small, bought secondhand because rent was due and her grandmother's oxygen tank wasn't cheap. She was one spilled tray away from disaster. Yet, the boy's next scream cracked something open inside her chest. She saw herself at 5 years old hiding under a kitchen table while adults shouted, waiting for a mother who never came back from the hospital. Before common sense could scream louder, Linda was moving. Past the horrified maitre d' hissing, Wilt, don't. Past the bodyguards materializing from the shadows like smoke given muscle. She dropped to her knees on the polished hardwood, right in front of the sobbing child, close enough to smell the expensive leather of Edward's shoes. Hey, little man, she whispered, soft enough that only he could hear. You're just scared, right? This place is huge and loud, and there's too many strangers staring. I get it, I really do. The boy's mouth opened in another wail and stalled. Wet, furious eyes locked on hers. A hiccup. Another. The storm inside him wavered. Linda reached out, slow, and brushed a tear from his cheek with the pad of her thumb. It's okay to be scared. Doesn't mean you're not brave. Silence rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. For the first time in 47 excruciating minutes, the crying stopped. Only then did she look up. Edward Robinson was staring at her as if she'd just performed open-heart surgery with a dinner fork. Something stormy and ancient moved behind those gunmetal eyes: rage, wonder, recognition, hunger. His voice came low, lethal, and velvet rough. Don't stop. Not a request. Not even close. The chandeliers kept burning. The room held its breath. And, in one heartbeat, Linda T. Wilt stepped over an invisible line she could never uncross straight into the orbit of the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard, and the one child he would kill or die for. 6 hours earlier, she'd pushed through the staff entrance of La Lumiere clutching a prayer and a fake smile, convinced this job was her last chance to keep the lights on and her grandmother breathing. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city, and let's keep building this story together. 6 hours earlier, she'd pushed through the staff entrance of La Lumiere, clutching a prayer and a fake smile, convinced this job was her last chance to keep the lights on and her grandmother breathing. Now, 12 hours later, Linda's hands still shook as she untied her apron in the empty employee locker room. The restaurant had closed 20 minutes ago, but the echo of that little boy's sudden silence still rang louder in her ears than any clatter of plates ever had. She pressed her forehead to the cool metal locker and tried to breathe. You still have a job. You didn't get fired. That's what matters. Footsteps behind her. Soft, deliberate. She turned to find Claudette, the senior server who'd been at La Lumiere since the day it opened, leaning in the doorway with a look that was half warning, half pity. You went to his booth, Claudette said quietly. No accusation, just fact. I know. You don't know. Claudette glanced down the corridor, then stepped inside and shut the door. Listen to me, Cherry. Edward Robinson doesn't like surprises. He doesn't like attention, and he definitely doesn't like people touching what's his. He didn't seem angry, Linda said, hearing how small her own voice sounded. Claudette gave a short, humorless laugh. That's the problem. Angry would have been safer. You saw his face when the boy stopped crying? That wasn't anger. That was recognition. Like a wolf catching a scent, it decides it wants to follow. Linda swallowed. He said thank you. Thank you from Edward Robinson is not gratitude. It's a brand, honey. Congratulations. You've been noticed. Claudette's eyes flicked to Linda's cracked, reddened hands. Be careful, that man collects what interests him, and he never gives it back. She left without another word. Linda stared at the closed door long after the footsteps faded. The next night, Edward Robinson came back. Same booth. Same silent bodyguards melting into corners. Same little boy clutching a new napkin like a talisman. Only this time, the child's eyes big, storm cloud gray, just like his father's found Linda the moment they crossed the threshold. A small, grubby finger pointed straight at her across the dining room. Her. Every head turned. Waitstaff froze mid-motion. The sommelier actually dropped a cork. Edward didn't speak. He simply looked at his son, then followed the pointing finger to Linda. Something unreadable flickered across his face, too fast to name, too heavy to ignore, and he inclined his head once. A king granting permission. The maitre d' practically sprinted over. Miss Wilt. Mr. Robinson requests you personally tonight. Linda's heart tried to climb out of her throat. I'm not even supposed to be on the floor for another 10 minutes. Clock in now, he hissed. Do not make him wait. So she did. The boy, his name was Elias. She learned when Edward murmured it was already half out of the booth by the time she reached them, arms reaching. Linda knelt automatically, the way you catch a falling glass, before you realize you've moved. Hi again, she whispered. Elias buried his face in her shoulder without hesitation, small body trembling like a rabbit that had finally found a safe burrow. Over his dark curls, she met Edward's gaze. He was watching. Always watching. Not the room, not the exits her. The way she curved a protective hand over Elias's back. The way she swayed, just slightly. The way her grandmother used to rock her through asthma attacks and nightmares. Edward's jaw flexed. He didn't smile. Linda wasn't sure the man was physically capable, but the hard line of his shoulders eased a fraction. She took their order. Filet mignon, rare, for him. Mac and cheese with the fancy truffle oil for Elias, because apparently 4-year-old Mafia heirs had refined palates. Edward never looked at the menu. He never needed to. Every night that week, the same ritual. Edward arrived precisely at 8. Elias pointed. Linda served. The boy calmed. The staff whispered louder with each visit. She learned the rumors and fragments, passed like contraband cigarettes in the alley on smoke breaks. He owns half the docks in Boston. They say he once made a man disappear for looking at his late wife too long. 3 years ago, someone tried to muscle in on his territory. They found pieces of the guy in 3 different states. He doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, doesn't lose. And always, the same warning. Don't get close. But closeness happened anyway. On the 5th night, Elias fell asleep against her hip while she cleared their plates. Edward watched in silence for a long moment, then reached over and lifted the boy into his arms with a gentleness that didn't match the violence in his reputation. Elias stirred, whimpered, reached blindly. Linda acted on instinct, brushing the hair back from the child's damp forehead. Shh. You're safe. Elias settled instantly. Edward's eyes tracked the motion like it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever witnessed. Later, when the dining room had emptied and the lights dimmed to a honeyed glow, Edward remained in the booth, alone. Elias had been carried out to the car 20 minutes earlier by a bodyguard built like a refrigerator. Linda approached with the check presenter, fully expecting him to leave without a word, the way he always did. Instead, he spoke. "How did you know?" His voice was low, rough from disuse, like a blade dragged across velvet. Linda hesitated. "I'm sorry?" What he needed. "How did you know what to say?" She shifted her weight, suddenly aware of how close he was, how the booth trapped his heat and the faint scent of cedar and gun oil. "I didn't," she admitted. "I just remembered being scared like that. When everything's too big and too loud and you don't know why everyone's looking at you. Sometimes you don't need someone to fix it, you just need someone to see it." Edward studied her for a long, weightless moment. Something raw flickered across his face, gone so fast, she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. He stood. Towered, really. She barely reached the center of his chest. "Thank you, Linda." He said her name like he'd been tasting it for days. For seeing him. Then he was gone, the space where he'd been suddenly cold. That night, when she opened her locker to retrieve her coat, a small dove-gray box sat on the top shelf. No bow, no card, just heavy, expensive paper and her name inked in black. Inside, a pair of butter, soft leather gloves lined with cashmere, the kind that cost more than she made in a month. Beside them, a tiny glass jar of salve that smelled like lavender and something medicinal. For her hands. The ones cracked and bleeding from bleach and hot water and years of scrubbing other people's messes. She knew who they were from before she even touched them. Linda stood in the fluorescent quiet of the locker room, gloves clutched to her chest, heart hammering against the leather like it wanted out. She should throw them away. Should march to the alley dumpster and drop the box like it burned. Instead, she slipped the gloves on. They fit perfectly. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse fortified like a fortress, Edward Robinson sat in the dark and watched his sleeping son breathe easy for the first time in months, and allowed himself one dangerous, unfamiliar thought. Mine. The change happened so smoothly that Linda almost missed the moment her life stopped belonging to her. It started with the schedule. Monday morning she came in for the lunch shift and found her name written in black marker on the private dining board. Wilt. Booth 12. Permanent. No discussion, no request, just ink and finality. Claudette only lifted one perfectly sculpted brow. Congratulations, Sherry. You've been promoted to the most dangerous table in the city. By the end of that same week, the maitre d' no longer bothered assigning her to any other section. If Edward Robinson was in the building, Linda served him. If he wasn't, she floated like a ghost until he arrived. And he arrived every single night now. 8 o'clock on the dot, the heavy glass doors would part and Elias would come in first, small hands swallowed by his father's, eyes scanning the room until they found her. The moment they did, the tension in his little shoulders melted. He would tug free and run, weaving between tables with the single-minded devotion of a child who had decided Linda was the only safe place in a world full of sharp edges. The bodyguards adjusted without a word, where once they stood like statues at the corners of the dining room, now 2 of them shadowed her. Never close enough to crowd, never far enough to be useless. When she carried heavy trays, one would appear to steady them. When she crossed the slick marble toward the kitchen, another would angle his body between her and the entrance. They never spoke to her. They never needed to. Their presence was a silent, living wall. Linda told herself it was temporary. A rich man's gratitude. A phase. She was wrong. The first time she noticed the black SUV, she was too exhausted to be afraid. It was parked across the street from her grandmother's crumbling brownstone in Queens, engine idling, tinted windows reflecting the orange streetlight like blind eyes. She stared at it for a long minute, grocery bags cutting into her wrists, then shook her head and went inside. Probably someone waiting for a ride share. New York was full of strangers. The second time, the same SUV followed her subway car for 3 stops, gliding along the avenue above while she rode below. She caught sight of it when she climbed the stairs at her station, heart kicking once, hard, before she forced herself to laugh. "You're being paranoid, Linda." The third time, she was on foot, cutting through the park shortcut at 1:17 a.m. because the trains were down. Footsteps behind her, measured, unhurried. She walked faster. They kept pace. When she spun around, the path was empty, only the rustle of leaves and the distant growl of an engine pulling away. That night, she stood under the shower until the water went cold, trying to scrub the crawling feeling off her skin. The fourth night, Edward was waiting for her when she came out the staff exit. He leaned against the matte black Maybach like a man who owned the darkness itself, coat open despite the November bite, hands in his pockets. Elias was already asleep in the back seat. She could see the small shape curled under a cashmere blanket through the open door. Edward didn't speak until she was close enough to smell cedar and gun oil again. "You're being followed." His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but the words landed like fists. "I noticed," she managed. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I thought—" She stopped. What had she thought? That she could handle it? That it was coincidence? That she still had the luxury of pretending her life was normal? Edward stepped forward, close enough that the streetlight carved sharp shadows across the ink on his throat. "When you knelt in front of my son," he said, voice low, lethal, and impossibly gentle, "you stepped into my world. That means I keep you safe now, whether you ask me to or not." Linda's pulse hammered in her ears. "I didn't ask for any of this." "I know." His eyes flicked over her face, cataloging every sleepless shadow, every cracked knuckle. "But Elias did. And I don't deny him anything that keeps him breathing easy." He opened the passenger door. "Get in. We're taking you home." She should have said no. She got in. The next 3 weeks blurred into a rhythm that felt both surreal and inevitable. Edward's driver took her home every night. Sometimes Edward was in the car, sometimes not. Either way, the black SUV never reappeared. Elias began waiting for her at the staff entrance on her days off, standing between 2 silent bodyguards clutching a new stuffed rabbit, Snow White, one ear flopped over, like a peace offering. The first time it happened, Linda almost cried in the alley. Edward started leaving things in her locker. A thick winter coat that cost more than her rent. A phone, brand new, untraceable, only 1 number programmed. An envelope with cash thick enough to cover her grandmother's medical bills for 6 months. No note. Never a note. She tried to give it back. Once. He'd looked at her for a long moment, something stormy and exhausted in his eyes, then simply said, "He sleeps through the night when he knows you're safe. Take the money, Linda." She took it. And still, she told herself it was temporary. Until the night, she learned what temporary really meant in Edward Robinson's world. It was a Thursday, slow for once. Elias had fallen asleep early, head on Linda's lap while she read him a picture book about a lost penguin. Edward watched from across the booth, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, tattoos flexing every time he turned a page of the newspaper he wasn't reading. One of the bodyguards approached, Victor, the one with the scar through his eyebrow, and murmured something in Edward's ear. Edward's entire posture changed. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. He stood, buttoned his jacket, then leaned down and pressed a kiss to the top of his sleeping son's head. "Take Elias to the residence," he told Victor. "I'll handle this." Linda watched them leave, a strange ache in her chest, then started clearing the table. 20 minutes later, she went to the kitchen for fresh linens and heard voices through the cracked door of the private wine cellar, angry, low, Russian maybe. One of them was Edward's. She should have kept walking. She didn't. The door was ajar just enough. She saw Edward first, back to her, shoulders filling the narrow space. Two men stood in front of him. One bleeding from the mouth. The other holding a knife like he wasn't sure whether to use it or drop it. "You skimmed from the dock shipment," Edward said. His voice was ice over steel. "That money was earmarked for the families of the men your cousin put in the ground last year. You stole from widows." The bleeding man spat blood onto the concrete. "It was a mistake." "No," Edward cut in. "A mistake is forgetting to tip your waiter. This was a choice." He moved so fast, Linda didn't see the gun until it was pressed under the man's chin. "You get one chance to fix it," Edward continued, conversational again. "You return every dollar by sunrise, and you leave the city tonight. You don't, and they'll be finding pieces of you in the Hudson for weeks. Choose." The man started sobbing. Linda's tray slipped from her fingers. Silverware clattered like gunfire. Edward spun. For one heartbeat, the man in the cellar vanished, and the monster took his place, eyes flat, black, fingers still on the trigger, death in human form. Then recognition slammed into him. The mask cracked, just enough. Linda. She was already backing away, linens forgotten, breath sawing in and out. He holstered the gun in one smooth motion and came after her. She made it halfway down the service corridor before his hand closed around her wrist, not bruising, but unbreakable. "Let me go," she whispered. It sounded like begging. "Never," he answered, soft as a vow. He pulled her into the empty manager's office, shut the door, and leaned against it so she couldn't bolt. "Ask me," he said. She couldn't speak. Her throat was full of broken glass. "Ask me what you just saw." You were going to kill him." "I was giving him a choice." His voice never rose. "He chose wrong, he dies. That's how this works." "That's not—" She shook her head, tears burning. "You're not a businessman, you're—" "The head of the Robinson organization," he finished. "Yes." The words hung between them like smoke. "I never lied to you, Linda. I just let you believe what was safer." "Safer?" She laughed, a broken sound. "I want out. I want away from you, from all of this." "You don't get out." He stepped closer. "Not anymore. They know your face. They know what you mean to Elias. To me. I'm not yours. You became mine the moment my son breathed easy in your arms." His voice cracked on the last word, just barely, but she heard it. "I don't know how to do this gently. I don't know how to let you walk away and still keep you alive. I'm trying, Linda. I'm fucking trying." She stared at him, chest heaving. The door opened a crack. A small, sleepy voice. "Linda?" Elias stood there in his pajamas and bare feet, hair sticking up, clutching the white rabbit. He looked between them, bottom lip trembling. Edward went to his knees instantly, all the terrifying violence draining out of him like water from a cracked glass. "I'm here, buddy," he murmured, opening his arms. But Elias walked past him. Straight to Linda. He wrapped his arms around her legs and buried his face in her stomach. "Don't cry," he whispered, the longest sentence she'd ever heard from him. "Please don't cry." Something inside her shattered. Edward watched them, jaw clenched so tight she thought it might break. His eyes were wet. He didn't bother hiding it. "I won't lie to you again," he said quietly. "I can't. But I swear on his life, I will keep you both safe, even if you hate me for it." Linda looked down at the child clinging to her, then at the man on his knees in front of her, a king brought low by the two people he would burn cities for. She was terrified. She was furious. She was, against every instinct screaming at her to run, starting to believe him. "I need time," she said finally, voice raw. Edward closed his eyes, relief and agony warring on his face. "You have it," he answered. "All the time you need. But you don't leave this building tonight, not alone, please." She didn't fight when he led her to the car. Didn't fight when Victor drove them through the city to a skyscraper that touched the clouds. Didn't fight when the private elevator opened directly into a penthouse that looked like a fortress disguised as a home. Elias fell asleep against her shoulder in the elevator, warm and trusting. Edward carried him to bed, then came back and stood in the doorway of the guest room like he was afraid to cross the threshold. "I'll be down the hall if you need anything," he said. "Anything." Linda sat on the edge of the enormous bed, still in her work clothes, hands shaking. "Edward." He froze. "I'm scared of you," she whispered. "I know," he whispered back. "I'm sorry." Then he left her alone with the city lights glittering like broken glass beyond the bulletproof windows and the terrifying realization that running wasn't an option anymore. Not because he would stop her, but because part of her, the part currently breathing in the scent of little boy sleep and expensive cotton, no longer wanted to. The first note was written in ordinary black Sharpie on a torn piece of brown paper bag. It was wedged under the wiper blade of the beat-up Corolla she still kept parked behind her grandmother's brownstone, even though she hadn't driven it in weeks. Asterisk. Asterisk. Tell your boss the boy isn't the only thing we can take. Asterisk. Asterisk. She stared at it for a full minute in the gray dawn, stomach folding in on itself. Then she crumpled it, shoved it deep into her coat pocket, and told herself it was a prank. Some bored kid. A mistake. Nothing more. But the next morning, there were two men on the corner when she left for the early shift. One lit a cigarette and didn't bother hiding that he was watching her. The other took a photo with his phone. She took a different train. They were waiting at the restaurant's service entrance when she arrived. That night she asked Victor, the scarred bodyguard who now drove her everywhere, to drop her 3 blocks away. He looked at her in the rear view like she'd lost her mind, but did it anyway. She walked the long way, cutting through alleys, heart jackhammering. When she finally reached the brownstone, a man was sitting on the bottom step of her stoop, hood up, hands in his pockets. He didn't move when she froze. He just tilted his head and smiled, slow and ugly. Linda turned and ran. She didn't stop until she was inside the lobby of Edward's building, lungs burning, security already moving toward her because the doorman had seen her face on the cameras. She didn't tell Edward. Not yet. She told herself she could still handle it. She was wrong. 3 nights later, the intruder came. She woke to the softest click of her bedroom door. At first, she thought it was her grandmother, wandering, confused again by the pain meds. Then the hallway light sliced across a black balaclava and gloved hands. He was already inside the room. Linda screamed, scrambled backward on the mattress, knocking the lamp to the floor. The man didn't lunge. He simply raised one finger to the place where his mouth would be. Shh. She grabbed the phone Edward had given her, the one she swore she'd never use, and hit the only number programmed. It rang once. "Linda?" Edward's voice, instantly awake. "Someone's in my room." The line went dead in her hand because the intruder had crossed the space in 2 silent strides and ripped the phone away. He crushed it under his boot like it was nothing. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. He went through her drawers, her nightstand, the tiny desk where she kept the bills and the photos of her grandmother young and laughing. He took nothing. He was looking for proof. Proof that she mattered. When he left, he paused at the door and spoke for the first time, voice muffled and accented. "Tell Robinson the Volkov family sends its regards." Then he was gone, melting down the stairs like smoke. Linda sat in the wreckage of her sheets until sunrise, knees to her chest, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. At 5:47 a.m., the front door of the brownstone exploded inward. Edward came through it alone, gun drawn, coat flapping like wings. His eyes were wild, the civilized mask shredded away. He took one look at her curled on the bed, face blotched with tears, and something feral broke across his face. He holstered the gun, crossed the room in 3 strides, and pulled her into his arms so hard her ribs creaked. "I've got you," he rasped against her hair. "I've got you." She tried to speak. Couldn't. All that came out was a broken sob. He held her until the shaking stopped, until her breathing evened out against his chest. Then he pulled back just enough to see her face. "Pack a bag. 1 bag. You're never coming back here." "Edward." "No." The word cracked like a whip, but his hands were gentle, cradling her face. "They got inside. They put hands on what's mine. That ends tonight." She didn't argue. 43 minutes later, she was in the Maybach, one duffel on the seat beside her, staring out at the city as it blurred past. Edward sat opposite, elbows on his knees, watching her like she might vanish. When they reached the penthouse, dawn was bleeding pink across the river. Elias was already awake, standing in dinosaur pajamas at the top of the marble staircase, White Rabbit clutched to his chest. The second he saw Linda, he ran. She dropped the duffel and caught him, burying her face in his curls as he wrapped arms and legs around her like a koala. "You came home," he whispered. "Home." The word lodged in her throat like a stone. Edward watched them, something ancient and aching moving behind his eyes. Later, after Elias was tucked back into, and the guards had tripled outside every door, Edward showed her the guest wing. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A bed bigger than her old apartment. A bathroom that looked like a spa. Everything smelled like cedar and safety and money. She stood in the middle of it, arms wrapped around herself, feeling small and invaded and terrifyingly relieved. Edward lingered in the doorway. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one gets in without my say, so. Not ever again." She nodded. Couldn't speak. He started to leave, then stopped. "I should have moved you weeks ago," he said, voice raw. "I thought distance would keep you safer. I was wrong. I'm sorry." Then he was gone, door closing with a soft click that sounded permanent. That was night 1. The penthouse was a gilded cage with a heartbeat. Guards changed shifts without a sound. Cameras watched every corner. The elevator only opened with a retinal scan or Edward's handprint. Linda wandered the halls like a ghost, jumping at shadows that turned out to be priceless art. Elias became her shadow. He followed her from room to room, chattering in half-sentences that grew longer every day. "Linda, look, the sky juice. Orange juice on the counter. Linda, read the Penguin again. Linda, will you stay forever?" She never knew how to answer that last one. Edward kept his distance. He was there for breakfast, tying Elias's shoes with careful fingers. There for dinner, cutting steak into tiny pieces while Elias babbled. But at night, he disappeared into his office or onto the balcony with a phone pressed to his ear and murder in his voice. She caught fragments. They touched her room. "Find every Volkov rat in this city. I want names. Make it hurt." She pretended not to hear. On the 7th night, the storm hit. Thunder cracked over Manhattan like artillery. Elias woke screaming from a nightmare, thrashing against memories he couldn't name. Linda ran to his room in one of Edward's borrowed t-shirts, sliding into the bed and pulling the boy against her chest. "Shh, baby, I've got you. You're safe, you're home." She rocked him until the sobs turned to hiccups, until his small hand fisted in her shirt and refused to let go. Edward stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the hallway light, fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. When Elias finally slipped back into uneasy sleep, Edward didn't move. Linda eased out from under the boy, tucked the blankets around him, and walked over. "He okay?" Edward asked, voice hoarse. "He will be." Edward nodded once. Then, so quietly, she almost missed it. "I wasn't there the first time." She waited. He stared at his son's sleeping form like it was both miracle and punishment. 16 months ago. I was in Chicago closing a deal. They took him from the park. Nannies couldn't stop it. 3 days. 72 hours of thinking I'd lost the only good thing I ever made. His voice cracked. They sent me a finger. His finger. It was the nannies, but I didn't know that then. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. "I got him back." Edward continued, flat and terrible. "Paid 10 million and painted half the city red. But he hasn't spoken a full sentence since, not until you." He finally looked at her, and the raw grief in his eyes stole her breath. "I'm poison, Linda. Everything I touch ends up bleeding. But he needs you, and I—" He stopped, jaw working. "I don't know how to let you go without breaking what's left of him. Of me." Thunder rolled again, closer. Linda reached out without thinking and laid her hand over his heart. It was pounding like a war drum. "I'm still scared of you," she whispered. "I know. But I'm more scared of what happens to him if I leave." Edward closed his eyes like the words were both salvation and damnation. Another crash of thunder. The lights flickered. When they came back on, he was closer. So close, she could feel the heat radiating off him. "I won't touch you," he said, voice shaking with restraint. "Not unless you want it, not ever." But his hand lifted, slow, and hovered an inch from her cheek, asking. Linda leaned in. The first brush of his lips was barely there, a question, a prayer. The second was deeper, hungrier, 16 months of terror and guilt and desperate gratitude pouring out of him in one trembling exhale. She kissed him back. His hands came up to cradle her face like she was something holy and breakable. Hers fisted in his shirt, anchoring. It was slow, reverent, almost agonizing, like two people learning how to breathe again. When they broke apart, foreheads still touching, both of them were shaking. "I'm not just territory anymore, am I?" she whispered against his mouth. "No," he rasped. "You're the only thing keeping me human." Lightning flashed, illuminating them in stark white. In the glow, she saw it clearly. The most dangerous man in the city on the verge of falling to his knees for her. And she realized with a jolt that terrified her more than any masked intruder ever could. She was falling too. For 10 days, the penthouse felt almost like peace. Mornings began with Elias padding into their bed. He had stopped asking whose bed it was, and wedging himself between them like a warm comma. Edward would pretend to still be asleep just so he could feel small fingers patting his cheek and hear the whispered, "Papa, wake up." Linda made smiley pancakes. Afternoons were coloring books spread across a marble floor that cost more than most houses, Elias's tongue poking out in concentration while Linda narrated wild stories about pirate penguins. Evenings were quiet. Edward coming home earlier than he ever had in his life, tie already loosened, rolling up $1,000 sleeves to build crooked block towers that Elias knocked down with gleeful shrieks. The guards still stood at every door, but they had started nodding at Linda instead of staring through her. The city still crawled with monsters, but inside these walls the monsters felt far away. Edward kissed her every night like he was still asking permission. She gave it every time, pulling him deeper, letting him anchor himself in her the way Elias did. They never said I love you. They didn't need to. It lived in the way Edward's hands settled on the small of her back when they walked past windows, in the way Linda fell asleep with her cheek over his heart so she could be sure it was still beating. It couldn't last. It was a Tuesday in early December when the call came. Edward was in the walk-in closet shrugging into a fresh shirt when his phone buzzed once, an encrypted tone Linda had never heard before. His entire body went rigid. "I have to go," he said, already reaching for his holster. "Old blood. A sit-down with the Albanians. If I don't show, it's war on 3 boroughs." Linda's stomach dropped. "Take more men." "I am." He cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone like he was memorizing it. 20 on the convoy. 10 staying here. Nothing gets through that door, I swear it. Elias ran in then, Rabbit dragging behind him. "Papa, stay, we're building a castle." Edward dropped to one knee, pressed a hard kiss to his son's curls. "Hold the fort for me, soldier. Keep Linda safe, yeah?" Elias saluted with sticky fingers. Edward looked at Linda one last time, something fierce and terrified in his eyes, then he was gone. The elevator doors closed, and the penthouse felt suddenly too large, too quiet. She locked the reinforced door anyway. Set the alarm herself. Tried to pretend her hands weren't shaking. They played for 2 hours. Hide and seek. Elias's giggles echoing off marble. Then, a movie on the massive screen, Elias curled on her lap, Rabbit tucked under his chin. He fell asleep halfway through the penguins dancing. Linda carried him to his room, tucked him in, kissed the soft spot behind his ear that smelled like baby shampoo and safety. She stood in the doorway longer than necessary, watching his chest rise and fall. Then the lights went out. Not a flicker. Total, sudden black. Red emergency strips kicked in along the baseboards, bathing everything in blood-colored glow. The alarm started as a low whine and escalated into a scream that clawed at her eardrums. She ran for Elias. Gunfire, close, deafening, cracked through the hallway like thunder inside the walls. She scooped Elias up just as the bedroom door exploded inward. 4 men in black tactical gear poured in, rifles raised. One had a patch on his shoulder she recognized from whispered nightmares. A red wolf snarling. Volkov. Elias woke screaming. Linda bolted for the panic room. 10 steps, 8, 5. A hand clamped around her ankle and yanked. She went down hard, twisting to shield Elias as they hit the floor. The boy's screams turned shrill, animal. A rifle butt came down. Pain exploded across her temple. The world tilted, sound muffled and far away. She clawed at the carpet, trying to crawl, trying to keep Elias behind her. Rough hands ripped him from her arms. "No," it came out broken. "Please take me instead." The man holding Elias laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "We were told to leave you breathing, sweetheart. Boss wants Robinson to feel it twice as long." Elias reached for her, small face purple with terror. "Linda, Linda!" Then they were gone, footsteps thundering down the hall. Linda screamed, raw, guttural, nothing human left in it. She dragged herself after them, blood dripping into her eye, vision swimming. The front doors hung off their hinges. Bodies of Edward's men littered the marble like broken dolls. She made it to the elevator before her legs gave out. That was how Edward found her 23 minutes later, on her knees in a lake of other people's blood, fists beating weakly against the sealed elevator doors, screaming Elias's name until her voice shredded. He came off the private elevator like a force of nature, coat torn, knuckles bleeding. He'd clearly carved his way through the ambush downstairs. The second he saw her, something inside him shattered aloud. "Linda." "They took him," she sobbed. "I couldn't. I tried." He dropped beside her, hands hovering, afraid to touch the damage. His gaze raked over the bruise blooming across her temple, the blood in her hair, the desperate animal terror in her eyes. "I failed him," she whispered. "I failed you both." "No." His voice cracked like ice breaking. He gripped her shoulders hard enough to bruise, forced her to meet his eyes. "No. They failed, and now they will pay." He pulled her into his chest, arms iron bands around her shaking body, and for one heartbeat, he let himself break, face buried in her neck, shoulders heaving with one silent, wrenching sob. Then the devil stepped back in. He stood, lifting her with him like she weighed nothing. "Victor!" he roared. The bodyguard appeared, face pale, blood pouring from a gash above his eye. "They had inside schematics, boss. Someone sold us out. Find them. Gut them. Then bring me every Volkov on the eastern seaboard." Edward carried Linda to the bedroom, set her on the edge of the bed only long enough to peel off his ruined jacket and press a gun into her trembling hands. "Anyone comes through that door who isn't me, you shoot. Understand?" She nodded, tears cutting tracks through the blood on her cheeks. He kissed her once, hard, desperate, tasting of copper and vengeance, then he was gone. The hunt began at 11:47 p.m. By midnight, every soldier loyal to the Robinson name was on the streets. By 1 a.m., the police scanners went suspiciously quiet. Someone had paid someone else a great deal of money to look the other way. By 2 a.m., 3 Volkov warehouses were burning. Linda refused to stay behind. She sat in the front seat of the lead SUV, Edward's blood-soaked coat around her shoulders, hair matted with her own blood, eyes flat and deadly. "I know what scares him," she said quietly as they sped across the bridge. "He'll be looking for light under the door. He'll be calling for me. If we find the room with the crack of light, we find Elias." Edward didn't argue. He simply reached over and laced his fingers through hers like she was the only thing keeping him sane. They tore the city apart piece by piece. A Volkov lieutenant missing 3 fingers by 2:47 a.m. A captain found dangling by his ankles from the Williamsburg Bridge at 3:12, screaming coordinates between sobs. At 3:58 a.m., they found the warehouse in Red Hook, abandoned, condemned, perfect. Edward didn't wait for backup. He kicked the door off its hinges and walked into hell with a gun in each hand and murder in his heart. The gunfire was deafening, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning inside, corrugated metal. Linda stayed on his 6, smaller pistol steady in her grip, picking off anyone who tried to circle behind him. Bodies dropped. Edward never slowed. He moved like something out of nightmares, fluid, relentless, every bullet finding a home. When the last man fell, silence rushed in, broken only by distant sirens and the crackle of flames from the charges Edward's men were already setting. A thin line of light glowed beneath a rusted door at the far end. Linda's heart stopped. Edward reached it first. He didn't bother with the handle, one kick and the door exploded inward. Elias was in the corner, knees to chest, rabbit clutched like a shield, face streaked with tears and snot. The second he saw them, he launched himself forward with a wail that cracked straight through Edward's chest. "Papa Linda." Edward caught him midair, crushing the boy to his heart, arms shaking so hard he nearly dropped him. "I've got you." He rasped over and over, voice breaking. "I've got you. I've got you." Elias's small hands reached past him, frantic. "Linda, Linda, please." Edward turned, still clutching his son, and Linda was there. She wrapped her arms around them both, burying her face in Elias's hair, breathing him in. Alive, alive, alive. They sank to the filthy floor together, a tangle of blood and tears and impossible relief. Edward's hand found the back of her neck, pulled her close until their foreheads touched over Elias's curls. Outside, the warehouse began to burn. Inside, the three of them held on like they would never let go again. The warehouse was still burning when the convoy tore back across the bridge, but none of them looked behind. The sky over Brooklyn bled orange and black, sirens far away, too late, already paid to forget what they'd seen. Inside the lead SUV, there was only the sound of breathing, 3 sets, ragged and alive. Elias had cried himself hoarse somewhere between the Inferno and the Midtown Tunnel. Now he lay curled against Linda's chest, soot-smudged cheeks streaked clean where tears had cut rivers through the grime, one fist twisted so tightly in the front of her borrowed sweater that his knuckles were white. Edward sat opposite them, elbows on his knees, head bowed. His shirt was torn open at the collar, blood, theirs, impossible to tell, drying in dark constellations across the white cotton. His hands shook, minute tremors he couldn't quite hide, as he stared at the floor between his boots like it might open and swallow them all if he looked away too long. Linda's own body felt borrowed, someone else's ribs aching, someone else's blood crusted in her hair. Only the small, warm weight of Elias kept her tethered to the earth. When the private elevator opened directly into the penthouse, the silence was absolute. No guards rushed forward. They had been ordered to stay below, to give the three of them this one moment without eyes or guns or questions. Edward stepped out first. He turned, reached for his son with the careful reverence of a man handling something holy. Elias stirred, whimpered, clung tighter to Linda. Edward's arms fell back to his sides. Something raw and helpless flickered across his face. Linda stood on legs that didn't want to hold her and carried Elias inside herself. The living room was exactly as they'd left it hours ago. Block tower still standing, half-finished cocoa cooling on the coffee table, the ridiculous Penguin movie paused on the screen with one bird mid-dance. She sank onto the wide leather couch, Elias refusing to release his stranglehold on her neck. Edward followed like a man walking toward his own judgment. He stopped 2 feet away, towering, filthy, terrifying, and utterly undone. Elias lifted his head just enough to peek at his father through damp lashes. Then he did the thing that broke Edward completely. He reached one small, trembling hand toward him. Edward made a sound, half sob, half prayer, and dropped to his knees on the rug. Elias crawled from Linda's lap straight into his father's arms, burrowing into the ruined shirt like he could disappear inside Edward's heartbeat. Edward clutched him so tightly. Linda heard the air leave the boy's lungs in a soft whoosh, then adjust, settle, accept the crushing safety of it. Father and son stayed like that, foreheads pressed together, breathing each other in, until Elias's eyes fluttered shut from pure exhaustion. Only then did Edward look up. Linda hadn't moved. She sat curled into the corner of the couch, arms wrapped around herself to keep all the pieces from falling out. Edward's gaze moved over her slowly. The bruise blooming purple across her temple, the split in her lip, the blood in her hair, the tear tracks cutting through the soot on her cheeks. Something in him shattered wide open. He shifted Elias gently to one arm, the boy already limp with sleep, and reached for her with the other. His hand hovered, filthy and shaking. Waiting. Linda unfolded herself and went to him. The moment her knees hit the rug, Edward pulled her in, sandwiching Elias between them, wrapping them both in arms that still trembled with adrenaline and terror and a gratitude too massive for words. They stayed on the floor for a long time, breathing the same air, sharing the same heartbeat. Eventually, Edward stood, lifting Elias without waking him, and carried him to the nursery. Linda followed on legs that felt made of glass. She watched Edward peel off the soot-streaked pajamas, clean his son's face with a warm cloth, slide him into fresh ones covered in tiny moons and stars. He tucked the white rabbit, miraculously still with them, under one small arm, pressed a lingering kiss to Elias's forehead. Then he turned to her. Linda stood in the doorway, swaying. Edward crossed the room in 3 strides and lifted her into his arms like she weighed nothing. He carried her down the hall to the master bedroom, past the ruined living room, past the guards who would never speak of the blood on the marble. He set her on the edge of the enormous bed, knelt, and started untying her shoes with careful, reverent fingers. Linda watched him, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. When he reached for the hem of her sweater, stiff with blood and smoke, she caught his wrists. "Edward." He froze. "I need to know what I'm choosing," she whispered. "All of it, no more half-truths." He sat back on his heels, hands falling to his thighs, and nodded once. "Ask me anything." She swallowed. "How many people died tonight?" 17. No hesitation. "Maybe more. I stopped counting after I found him." "Will there be retaliation?" "Yes." His voice was raw. "They'll come again. They always do. And you'll kill them. I'll burn the whole fucking world down before I let them touch either of you again." The words were a vow, ancient and unbreakable. Linda closed her eyes. She saw the masked man in her grandmother's house. Saw Elias being ripped from her arms. Saw the warehouse burning. Then she opened them and looked at the man kneeling in front of her, covered in the proof of what he would do, what he had done, to keep them safe. "I used to think there were 2 kinds of monsters," she said quietly. "The ones who hide under beds, and the ones who sleep in them." Edward flinched like she'd struck him. "But tonight I learned there's a 3rd kind," she continued. "The ones who become whatever monster they have to, so the people they love never have to face the first 2 alone." She reached out, cupped his jaw, felt the tremor there, the stubble and the blood, and the man. "I'm not leaving, Edward." His breath left him in a shudder. "I'm not asking you to be safe or good or anything the world would recognize as decent. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you're whatever you need to be. Because that little boy in there? He's mine now too. And I will burn with you if that's what it takes to keep him whole." Edward made a broken sound and pressed his forehead to her knees. Linda threaded her fingers through his hair, held him there while he shook apart. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were red-rimmed, ancient, stripped bare. "I have spent my entire life taking," he rasped. "Territory. Money. Lives. I never knew how to be given anything until you decided I was worth saving anyway." He rose slowly, pulled her to her feet, and kissed her. Not the careful, restrained kisses of the past weeks. This was deep and claiming and desperate tasting of blood and smoke and every unsaid word between them. His hands framed her face, thumbs wiping away tears she hadn't realized were still falling. When they broke apart, foreheads pressed together, breathing each other's air, he spoke against her lips. "You calmed him the first night," he whispered, voice cracking. "You saved him again tonight. You saved me every single day in between." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "You're not leaving my side. Not ever. Say it." "I'm not leaving," she answered, steady and sure. He kissed her again, softer this time, sealing it. Later, after the shower that washed the night away in rivers of red and black, after fresh clothes and fresh bandages, after Elias woke once, terrified, and they both crawled into his narrow bed until he slept again sandwiched between their heartbeats. They found themselves in the living room at dawn. The city was waking up beyond the bulletproof glass, gold lights spilling across the wreckage of the night before, broken glass swept into corners. Bloodstains hidden beneath rugs that would be replaced before lunch. Elias was asleep on Linda's lap, thumb in his mouth, rabbit tucked under his cheek. Edward sat beside them, one arm stretched along the back of the couch, fingers tracing idle patterns on Linda's shoulder. He watched them with an expression she had never seen on him before, open, unguarded, almost boyish in its wonder. She turned her head, met his eyes. He lifted her free hand, pressed a kiss to the inside of her wrist, right over the pulse that beat for both of them now. "My family," he whispered, the words rough with everything he still didn't know how to say. Linda laced their fingers together over Elias's sleeping back. "Yours," she answered simply. Outside, the sun rose higher, gilding the three of them in light that felt, for the first time in years, like forgiveness. Inside, the most dangerous man in New York held the two people who had made him human again, and knew, with a certainty deeper than any empire he'd ever built, that he would raise heaven itself before he let this go. And Linda, no longer just the waitress who knelt beside a crying child, no longer just protected territory, rested her cheek against the steady beat of a heart that belonged to her now, and understood that some storms don't destroy you. Some storms remake you into something stronger, something unbreakable, something that looks, from the outside, an awful lot like love.